All right, it is March 23rd, 2018, and we're talking today with Noel Snyder about his history in Portal. So it starts in 1967, I understand. So can you tell me, I'm assuming you guys came down to be at the research station, but I don't know the story.
No, well, yes, we did, but our first trip here was really just to follow up on a suggestion by Tom Eisner at Cornell, a professor that we were associated with when we were at Cornell. And he had been out here doing research and highly recommended this was on our honeymoon when we came here.
I thought I heard that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it was 1967, and we just loved the place. And even way back then, we said, well, this is a place where we're going to retire someday, not really thinking that would happen.
Even on your honeymoon.
Yeah, yeah. We were ready to retire then.
Did you come down to check out the possibility of research things? Or no?
Yeah, among other things, yeah. And we saw so much wildlife here, and we were interested in, at that time was the height of the DDT pesticide era. There was a lot of research getting started on various birds of prey, and we could see this was a fabulous place for birds of prey, and that this would be a logical place to make a study area out of, and there's the research station, perfect setup. And so that's what happened. That we didn't really start the research until 2 years later, 1969. And
before you go on that,
yeah,
I'm just curious, where did you guys stay when you were down here?
We were camping out.
In Sunny Flats? Or?
No, we were camping, and it's interesting, when we first got here, the place was jammed. Oh. Like, you don't see campgrounds filled today the way that we did back in the 1960s. The first time we got in here, late afternoon, South Fork was a campground then, and it was full. Right. So was Sunny Flats, so was Stewart, so was Idlewild. And we finally found the last space up at Herb Martyr for our first night in the mountains here. We later then moved to South Fork and just camped there for a while. Yeah. So it was a different era. A lot of people camping in those days, and South Fork as a campground was very nice. Now you can't even get there. Yeah. The floods have washed out the road, and it's a hike to get where we used to camp out.
Did you sounds like you took some time to check out the research station.
Yes, we did.
Well, who was the director?
It was
going on?
It was Vince Roth then. Vince Roth with Bobby in that time. This was before he married Barbara, which came a little later, and we were actually here for his marriage with Barbara, and I was the official photographer of the ceremony.
When was that?
Oh gosh, what year? I can't remember. Later, of course, but it was held right there at the research station. Yeah. So that was part of our association with the research station. And when we started the research, we began in 1969, and we're staying at the research station, which was for poor folks like us a bit expensive. So we were immediately looking for other alternatives. And by 1971, that was our third season, we just stayed at Cape Creek Ranch and found that was more economical, staying at the motel there than staying at the research station, and served our purposes well enough. So yeah, we rented a cabin there and made our own meals, but it gave us a flexibility. One of the things about staying at the research station is they have times for meals, and you have to get there at that time. It may be right in the middle of something you're doing out in the field, And so you always have to adjust your schedule to the station schedule as far as meal times are concerned. So we found it actually a preferable thing to stay down at Cave Creek Ranch for our third year. And during our third year, one of the leased cabins came available up near Herb Martyr. Yeah, well, it's they're privately owned cabins on Forest Service land. But one of them came up for sale, and the price was all of $3,100, which seems amazing in these days. And we went and talked to the owner, and we couldn't afford $3,100. So, but the owner knew we were interested, and nobody else made an offer on the place. And 6 months later, we got a note from the owner saying, "Name your price." She had to sell. She was in bad financial shape herself. So that's an interesting position to be put in. Name your price.
Doesn't happen very often.
Doesn't happen very price. At any rate, we decided, well, we could afford $1,900 sold, and so we've had that cabin ever since the early 1970s. Yeah, and it's been a wonderful place. Though the lease fee of the Forest Service is now greater than what we paid. That's the annual lease fee for the Forest Service is now greater than what we paid for the cabin.
And aren't you, people that own the cabins, you have to do so much maintenance a year?
Yeah, they have certain things. They want you to keep the leaves raked away from it. They have all sorts of restrictions what you can do on the external appearance of a cabin. They don't want brightly colored structures out there and so forth. And you can't build onto it except with special permission. So it's not as if you really owned a cabin. It's more like you're running a cabin. Yeah.
Would you guys be longest holders of a cabin lease, do you think?
We're not the longest. For example, the Joneses right across from us were there when we first moved in. And of course, there's been various attempts over the years to get rid of the cabins. And speaking of J. Jones, the Forest Service tried to do this way back there, and it was on the basis of pollution of the stream. The cabins were alleged to be the cause of the E. coli that you could pick up in the stream. And at the hearings they held, Jay pointed out to the Forest Service that there were cattle grazing on the same lands, and asked the question, can you tell us that the E. coli were not from the cattle
versus human?
Versus human, and of course they couldn't. So, I mean, this seems kind of humorous in retrospect, but that back in the early days, back in there, the real, I think, concern that a lot of people had as to how the Forest Service was managing things was there were an awful lot of cows on the land, and they were grazing the grass down to dirt. And I remember that Vince Roth was especially concerned about that. And this has changed a lot. It's public protests and whatnot eventually had an effect. And I can remember at the research station when the Forest Service people came for one of these meetings that they had, and they have hoops that they throw out, and then they count the grass stems, and they went out to assess the area, and they found no grass. And oops, is right. And so there's been a lot of gyrations over the years, but the big one, of course, was the mine fight that came in the 1990s. That's long after we weren't at the research station. This is mid-1990, and the Forest Service convened a meeting right there at the ranger station of the community to hear about the mining development that they were anticipating. And this was mining development. You look out your window, you're looking at part of the site that was affected by this potential mining development. And the mining company that was involved was the Newmont Mining Company, which is the biggest gold mining company in the world. Oh, they already knew there was gold here in the rocks, and they had staked claims over a huge area here. And what the Forest Service said was they had to go through a number of legal steps here. But what we could expect to see develop was a large open pit gold mine. And that this would be an operation that's run on what's known as heap leaching. Heap leaching is you make tremendous piles of pulverized rock which lie on a rubber membrane, and then you spray cyanide solution on the top surfaces. This percolates down through the pulverized rock, and cyanide removes gold so efficiently from these heaps. They can make a healthy profit on almost no gold at all. You don't have to have a rich deposit to make money out of these things. The problems are several, of course. And as residents, we didn't know anything about these problems, except that the idea of a huge open pit mine overlooking Portal, with all the dust that goes along with mining development, with what this would probably mean to the town in terms of disruption of the normal state of affairs, was frightening to most people. And but we were pretty much ignorant. And of course, we asked the Forest Service, well, is this in cement or can this be stopped? And we were informed by the Forest Service, no, they had no power to stop a mining development that was involving lands that were not what they call officially withdrawn from mineral leasing. Well, and of course, this land was not officially drawn from mineral leasing. And what we didn't know at that time was, yes, they could have withdrawn the lands. They have the legal authority to do so, but their policy was that they wouldn't do so as a response to a mineral development procedure, which essentially means that you do a mineral proposal, you'll get it, because the Forest Service will not oppose you, even though they have the legal authority to withdraw the lands at any time. But of course they did not offer us that they would do this. So we were told that this was, assuming things went ahead as they thought they would, this was something you couldn't stop. This was very alarming to the community. And for most of us who've never been political activists, this was, well, what do you do? And so a number of us got together and said, we got to do something, because this is the end of the canyon in terms of all the biological values of the canyon, not to mention the fact that these heap leach membranes always leak, and you always get contamination of your groundwater with cyanide, which is in the long run not a good thing. So we got together and we said, well, what the heck are we going to do? And Paul Hurt up the canyon.
I was just going to say, do you remember some of the people?
Yeah, Paul Hurt said, well, he knew a lawyer in Tucson, David Mullen, and we ought to get in touch with him because he had been involved with negotiations with the Forest Service on, for example, on the Mount Graham red squirrel issue. So we didn't know David Mullen, but we gave him a call. He said, come on in, tell me about it. Well, David became a donated volunteer lawyer on our behalf right from the start. And he guided us through much of what we did for the next 3 years, including being one of the people who would go to Washington to testify to committees. And I went to Washington with David. I can remember several times doing this. Anyway, David recommended we get in touch with an organization called the Mineral Policy Center in Washington, which we did. And they immediately laid out a lot of things that we needed to be aware of in terms of the challenge that we faced in trying to stop mineral development. At the same time, we also contacted our congressmen and senators. And at that point, we got very little in the way of, you might say, positive feedback from our congressional people. Yeah. At the start, they didn't want to touch the issue, and for obvious reasons, as we are well aware. So we contacted Jim Colby, who was our local congressman, and we got in touch with John McCain's operation. We also contacted DeConcini, who was a Democrat senator at that time. And we never got anything out of DeConcini. We got very respectful consideration from the Republicans, but not from DeConcini, who was the one Democrat that applied to our area. But none of them wanted to step in on this issue at the start. And so we were trying various routes here, and one of them was, well, let's talk to the mining company. Let's see if we can get them to reconsider this whole thing. And so we contacted the mining company, and I should mention the people that were especially active in this whole effort. Karen Hayes, Alden Hayes' wife, was especially important, and there were many others. This thing eventually became a community project. I can remember letter writing efforts that we would be over at Karen Hayes, and here are 25, 30 people licking envelopes. This is how you did it in those days. We didn't have an internet or any of that stuff we have today. So we did a massive community effort here. But as it turned out, the one route that was really successful for us, and I'll tell you why it was successful in a little bit, but initially was actually talking to Newmont Mining Corporation. We invited them to come down to Portal, and we'd have a session with them. And we got together over there in Narca and Allen's house, which in those days was Kevin and Conke's place. And we all sat around the table, and it was surprisingly friendly. This was not an antagonistic get-together. And basically, we asked them to reconsider this proposal because of all the amazing biodiversity values we have in this area. And you have to look at it from the standpoint of Newmont. Just in general, they can mine almost common rock and make a profit because the cyanide leaching is so efficient. There are thousands of places across the West they can mine for gold. They're not limited by this being the only place that has something they can make a profit out of.
A super rich deposit.
Yeah, we don't know how rich it was. We know they certainly had tested and found some gold here. Yeah. But from their perspective, they're not, if there's enough negatives about developing a certain area, they've got many other places they can mine. They're not desperate to mine any one particular place. Anyway, we found them very friendly, and they agreed to do their own evaluation of the canyon.
Sort of the impacts of their.
Yeah, whether this was really a place they shouldn't mine. I mean, in a very, they were very friendly people. And, but in the background, what was happening at the same time was, I, of course, was back in touch with Tom Eisner, who was the person that had got us out here in the very first place. Well, by that time, it was how many years earlier? Like, this was 1990.
Over 20.
Yeah. Anyway, Tom was still a good friend. And Tom, we by that time knew who the chief stockholder in Newmont was, a guy named Goldsmith. Interesting coincidence.
Yeah.
Who actually, this is the chief stockholder.
Okay.
Goldsmith, it turns out, is a very active conservationist and active in creating biosphere reserves down in Mexico. And in fact, I've been at one of his bioreserves down in Jalisco, and so very interested in wildlife. And his one of his closest friends, somebody named Miriam Rothschild, who was a very close friend of Tom Eisner. So you can sort of see what might have happened. Tom got in touch with Miriam Rothschild. I wrote a long, long letter to Miriam Rothschild about the whole situation, and she had a chance to talk to the chief stockholder of Newmont. And so perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that Newmont would do a real evaluation of this canyon. And just a few years ago, I finally met one of the people that they had on that committee, and who came to a talk I was giving in Tennessee to introduce himself and say, "Oh yeah, did you know?" And so it was like they came out with a strong statement: shouldn't mine this canyon.
This is the
mining company did this.
Yep.
Now, meanwhile, of course, we had been in a massive letter-writing campaign, and we were asking people all over the world who had been to the research station. Of course, we knew who had been there because they have a list of all the former people who've been to the research station, and they made it available to us so that we could contact people who really knew the canyon well. And there were literally tens of thousands of letters coming in. They were coming into the Forest Service, coming into Newmont, and coming into our political delegation, our congressional delegation, and the newspapers. So we got articles all across the country: New York Times, Science Magazine. Everybody became aware of the issue. So all this was going on. At the same time, Miriam Rothschild was going to Goldsmith, yeah. And Newmont was proving extraordinarily cooperative. Now, this is not a normal situation in mining battles. We had some remarkable advantages, but Newmont. This is within. I think it was December of the very first year. I think it was like 3 months or something like that. I can't remember exactly when the whole thing started, but I think it was December of the first year, December of '90, if I'm remembering this right, that Newmont announces to the world they're going to abandon their efforts to develop a mine here, but not just retire their claims. They're going to hold on to their claims so that nobody else can come in and develop this canyon. Now, this is crucial because, as it turned out, it took 3 more years to finally get the area withdrawn from mineral leasing. And it turned out Newmont was not our enemy. Our enemy was the U.S. Forest Service, right from the beginning, when they misled us about whether they could do something about the mineral application or could not. And they could, but they did not want to. And we found that every step of the way, now there were two ways open to withdraw these lands from mineral development. One is a simple administrative one where the Forest Service itself decides to withdraw lands for whatever reason. The other is a congressional one where Congress acts and officially withdraws lands from mineral development. And we pursued both. We got nowhere with administrative withdrawal with the Forest Service, even though Newmont had voluntarily said, we're withdrawing in order to protect these lands. And by that time, there were tens of thousands of letters coming into the Forest Service saying the same thing. And so what we got was a situation of, why is the Forest Service being so antagonistic to protecting these lands? There were such things that we knew there's one species of scorpion that just sits there on those lands, and you wipe it out by doing a mine development here. We have all this background because of the research station, and the biodiversity impacts of just the site itself, not considering the surroundings, all of which are going to be affected, were pretty impressive. So the Forest Service was not impressed. The Forest Service just simply wouldn't consider doing an administrative withdrawal until, and the date on this I'm really shy on, when they came out with their proposal. But they finally came out with a proposal to create what's called a national recreation area, which would include the canyon. National recreation area, okay? And this was in response to George Bush, this is the first Bush, having announced what's called a Great Outdoors Initiative. And in this initiative, there was, many millions of dollars were available now for the Forest Service to do anything that would promote
recreation.
Well, not just recreation, but values that were considered positive in the sense, like they could have created a conservation area instead of a recreation area. They told us that they couldn't. It was another lie from the Forest Service. They could have. And they said, well, conservation areas, that's for BLM and whatnot. Any federal agency can do this. This is the kind of nonsense we were getting. Anyway.
Was this at the Washington level of the forest?
Yes.
That's what I assumed. To the local.
No, the local area was proposing this. It would have to get congressional approval, okay?
Okay.
So they were proposing, finally, to withdraw these lands as part of this recreation area proposal they were making. And that's the only way they would do it. They refused to do it administratively. In other words, they were saying to the people in the community, you better support our national recreation area or you won't get your mineral withdrawal. And of course, at the same time, we're talking to McCain and the congressional people to get this done through Congress, not through the Forest Service. So we had two routes we could go here. But we immediately met with the Forest Service and said, basically, we thought you'd get support for such a proposal if you made this a national conservation area. But this doesn't make much sense as a national recreation area. There are no water sports here. There's no skiing, none of these things. And the lands they had in mind was the Chiricahuas, the Catalinas, and the Pinalenos. We told them, hey, yeah, make it a conservation area and we'll go along with it. But recreation area, we don't like that idea. Well, it wasn't just, those of us in Portal, and by that time we were an organization called Portal Mining Action Coalition, okay, PMAC. Wasn't just us, it was everybody in the area. To go with a proposal for a national recreation area, they had to hold public hearings around the area affected. So there were public meetings, one in Safford, one in Douglas. We went to 3 of them, as I remember. And at all these public meetings, they talk about this wonderful recreation area development they want to do for the mountains here. And somebody would always say, well, let's have a vote of the people here, whether they're in favor. And they didn't want to do this. But we got votes that at least, I remember the one in Douglas, where they said, all those who are in favor, this was like 120 people there at this meeting, and they said, all those in favor of this recreation area development raised their hand. And you looked around, and there was not a single hand that went up for this. And then after maybe a minute's pause, one hand goes up. But he wasn't voting, he was asking a question, as it turned out. So, hey, the local newspapers were at these meetings. They could see what the public response was, which was, hey, nobody wanted to see this place overrun with people attempting to do recreation, in quotes, whatever that would become. And this is ranchers, this is biologists like ourselves, it was everybody. And so the whole thing died. It died very brutally locally. They got no support for doing a national recreation area. And that was the end of it as far as Forest was concerned about withdrawing these lands. Meanwhile, Jim Colby and John McCain, and I want to especially thank the staff of John McCain on this, because we met with those folks and they had a very clear idea to how to make this all happen. And they were in constant touch with us, and they never had a misstep in terms of what happened.
They were supportive.
They were supportive of it. Now that the mining company was supporting it, it was now something that was supported by the Arizona delegation in toto. We had total support for a congressional bill going through Congress. And David and I went in for hearings on this bill in Washington, and we listened to the Forest Service opposing the bill for withdrawing these lands from mineral development. And they were quizzed very hard by the congressional people who said, well, you were willing to withdraw these lands for your national recreation area. Have they changed? Is it now inappropriate for them to be withdrawn from mineral? And their only answer that they gave, and it was almost unbelievable, the answer they gave, they said, well, we think mineral development is a province of the Forest Service, not Congress. Can you imagine them giving this kind of response?
To Congress.
To Congress. It didn't go anywhere, and of course the bill sailed through and finally passed, and it was Clinton who signed it, which was, I just looked it up, August 2nd, 1993. So it took 3 years to get it to happen. As Clinton's hand was descending to the paper to sign it, the Forest Service finally decided to support the bill. At the very end. So they wouldn't be on record as opposing this bill.
But had they not, it wouldn't have mattered anyway.
Wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
Because Congress has the full authority on this. Of course, now, with the politics we have in Washington now, Congress could withdraw this whole thing too. Anyway, I think it was called Cave Creek Preservation Act or something like that. And it's the only time I've ever been involved with legislation, national legislation. But it was fascinating to go to Washington and meet. We met with as many congressional people as we could get into to see and talk over the situation. And that's a fascinating process. And interestingly enough, And we got support from both parties on this. But in Arizona, I think it was no question it was the Republicans that pushed this through, and we got really no help from the Democrats, which is kind of interesting and unexpected in many ways.
Yeah.
And so yeah, my hat is off to McCain's staff. They did a wonderful job making this all happen. And
Did the mining company send? Were they?
I can't remember whether they were there, but they had already made a broad public statement. They supported the withdrawal of these lands from minerals. There were mining companies supporting this. And of course, from their perspective, they're getting a lot of points on this because remember, just at this time is when all these hearings are being held on revising the 1872 mining law, which you may be aware it was a very, very pro-mining piece of legislation that conservationists have been trying to revise for a long, long time with very little success. It places mineral development as a high priority in the way not just the Forest Service reacts to it, but the way BLM and other federal agencies react to it. And the mining companies have fought this vigorously. Now, you think of it, here comes Cave Creek Preservation Act, supported by a mining company. That gives them some political ammunition in this whole controversy of revising the 1872 law. And they'll say, see, the 1872 law works. Mm-hmm. And it worked in this one case, right, but only because of very special circumstances. So that's sort of the bigger political picture on it. So in a sense, we're bad guys from the perspective of many of the people in the conservation community.
That's an interesting twist.
I don't know how strong these feelings are, right. But there's so much going on. We went to some of these hearings on the 1872 mining law too. I mean, people coming in with mining hats on and whatnot. Amazing stuff, just amazing stuff. And I can remember one hearing. It was over in New Mexico, and the guy leading here it was the senator. What's his name? From Arkansas. And at one point, he is so infuriated by these, you might say, mining proponents, that he launches into a long tirade against them. And then at the end of it, he says, strike that from the record. At any rate, the politics of mining in this country are still pretty much the same way that they were back then. And the fight that's going on now over in the Santa Rias. And the Forest Service is not stopping it, the last I heard. But I don't know. I haven't followed it all that closely. But we had our own very favorable outcome here. Well, I mean, when you see Trump selling off national monument lands in Utah, and you say, is this just the start of what's going to be happening? It's hard to have supreme confidence in anything. As to the Forest Service, and we had many meetings with Forest Service people, right up to the regional forester. They were very disappointing in terms of public service doing what they were doing.
Especially given that the public position
was so strong.
And
so unanimous.
Yes.
It wasn't like there was one element out here who opposed what we were doing.
Right.
We didn't have any enemies here.
Yeah.
Nobody was deceived that this was going to be a great economic boon for Portal, and therefore we should support it. I should say almost nobody, but it was about as close to unanimous as you're ever going to get. And so I don't know that you can replicate what we did here very often. Remember, we could get to the chief stockholder here. How often does that happen? So there's a lot wrong with the 1872 mining law, at least as to how it's implemented. Yeah. Well, let me finish with a comment about the Forest Service, which is none of the people who we interacted with in 1990 and 91, 92 do we see in the Forest Service anymore. There's been turnover. And the Forest Service is a rather different organization now than it was then, just because personnel have changed.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more, let's say, biodiversity inclined now than it was then. So my negative comments about how they handled this issue are that I don't have confidence that they would do today what they did then. It's a different organization. And of course, they're there. They are the land stewards for the National Forest. We have to deal with them. And the most recent district rangers have been wonderful, have been very responsive to biodiversity questions, especially in the recent fires we've had and their input into how fire control should be implemented and so forth. Questions like that. I think the Forest Service has done a great job. And so these things change all the time. And it comes down to human beings. Who are they and in what position of power are they? And it's hard to generalize about organizations in any long-term sense because they change all the time. So I might mention that I've worked for a federal agency for most of my career, for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm well aware of many of the aspects of bureaucracy, and especially their chain of command restrictions, and how people at the bottom have a hard time getting their input heard at the top, especially if there's any political considerations involved. So these are problems that don't just affect the Forest Service, they affect the Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies as well.
Did you see many changes in the time you've been here, or has it been?
Yeah, there's been a lot of improvement in overgrazing.
Okay.
It was back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a real problem with it. It's been reduced in impact. There's a lot of good things that have happened. And the big change is we're getting fires now. And these are massive fires, and it's tied into a long-term drought that we're now in. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had wonderful rainfall, and nobody thought about wildfire threats. It was only, 95, whenever the rattlesnake fire happened, the first big one. And it was like, oh, this is the fire of the century. Of course, Horseshoe 2 was even much worse. Yeah, one other thing I should bring in here before we leave the mine issue completely is that the PMAC, Portal Mining Action Coalition, which really was a coalition, eventually evolved in something called Chiricahua Regional Council, which still exists and is set up as a conservation organization dealing with issues, local issues here as they arise, but has not had to be terribly active in recent years because there have not been, right here in the Chiricahua region, there have not been big issues since the mining issue and since the National Recreation Area issue.